Qantas Airlines says that the coronavirus outbreak could cost the airline as much as $99 million as it cuts flights to Asia by 15% until the end of May. That's at least minimum. Now, in a bid to stem the flow of financial losses, Qantas says it plans to adopt cash-saving measures. Qantas has suspended flights from Sydney to Shanghai, cut capacity to Hong Kong, and ended its Sydney to Beijing route earlier than expected after the Australian government imposed restrictions on travelers from mainland China. Joining me in the studio is Arise business correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya. Adefemi, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing good.
Welcome.
Better than Qantas.
Exactly. So starting with them, how are they planning on saving money in the face of all these losses? That's Qantas Airlines now.
Well, it's the really easy stuff. First, they're going to have a total employment freeze, so they won't be adding to their 30,000 strong employment fleet in terms of people. In addition to that, they are encouraging their existing employees to take annual leave now. So again, that just lessens the burden financially of having to pay even more payrolls as they begin to calculate how they're going to weather this storm that has caused so much friction to this carrier, especially because if we look at where they are placed geographically, servicing the Asia-Pacific region for an Australian carrier is imperative to their financial success. The fact that they've had to change their routes and lessen the amount of seats that are available on the routes that they have continued to keep is a hallmark of two things. One, the lack of demand there may be for people to go to mainland China for obvious reasons, but also the fact that it is difficult for airlines to land planes in China because of the frameworks that the Chinese state have put in place to make sure that they're able to contain this virus as quickly and as safely as possible.
Now, the losses aside,
Right.
things aren't that bad for Qantas Airlines? How are they looking?
I mean, like if we were to put them on a tipping scale, I mean, $900 million is a lot of money to the average person and also to a company. But if we look at the fact that their investors, their shareholders aren't too worried because their shares are still performing well throughout the day's trading, it's a silver lining on a really big grey cloud. So in as much as we can say that the fact that shares are continuing to, I won't say continuing, but have been performing well, all things considered, there is a lot that needs to be addressed. Qantas aren't alone, though, in the desire to change their operating standards in the face of this outbreak. You'll be well aware that Cathay Pacific, which is a flagship carrier for the Asia-Pacific region, has had to do the same thing. In fact, they forced their employees to take leave as soon as possible as a direct response to the fact that they could not service the routes specifically for that region.
Wow. Okay, so is there a possibility, though, that China could be, and there's suspicions to this, downplaying the severity of the virus outbreak?
What we know is that they have not been forthcoming to external support in the sense of the World Health Organization wanting to send in experts in so they could properly gauge the amount of cases, the severity of them, and put that information out to the world. They've not been forthcoming on that end. So if we talk about suspicions, you'd have to naturally ask yourself, well, why wouldn't you want the help of the World Health Organization in the face of such a huge pandemic?
Exactly.
Naturally, there is a lot for China to lose. It's marketing itself as a manufacturing hub. Its currency also wants to replace the dollar as the world's global currency. So the last thing a country like that, which has so many economic and business aspirations, is to say that, okay, we've got a huge healthcare pandemic. People can't come to the country. You've got the likes of American companies shutting up shop. You've got Starbucks closing 50% of their stores in China. It's a huge problem. So naturally, you could understand why the Chinese state isn't as forthcoming. But that doesn't change the fact that we're talking about lives and health here, and you have to be as transparent as possible.
Now, President Xi Jinping has said that the country could still meet its 2020 economic growth targets despite the virus. Do you agree? You think that's possible?
I think if we look at the facts, it'll be very difficult for China to do so. If we're looking at how businesses are already feeling the impact, we're going to see that when they release their quarterly data, it's impossible for that not to have an impact on the country where this virus started. So I think if we apply logic, it'd be a surprise And a good thing if China were able to meet up with its outlook growth or its growth targets. But if it doesn't, I mean, we'd all understand why.
There's so much more I want to ask you about that. But let me quickly get to Boeing now. Lawmakers in Washington have introduced legislation that would eliminate tax breaks for U.S. plane maker Boeing. Now, the move is to end a threat of international trade sanctions against Boeing. The World Trade Organization concluded last year that Boeing benefited from unfair subsidies from the state worth roughly $100 million a year. That's quite a lot of money. So lawmakers on Wednesday introduced bills in the state Senate and House proposing the end of a business rate tax break for aerospace companies that have saved Boeing more than $1 billion since 2004. This threatens to nullify Brussels' agreement to the World Trade Organization that Boeing continues to benefit from, an illegal state aid, the basis on which the right to impose tariffs were expected to be granted later this spring. So, Femi, you're still with us. Could this be the start of another trade war?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's already been marketed as the transatlantic trade war, and we can understand why. You've got the likes of the European Union behind Airbus, wanting to make sure that they're able to extend as much support legally as they can. They've failed to do that in current instances when we look at that. And then you've got on the other side of the ring, the United States backing Boeing. And naturally, there's been a huge rivalry between these two. And Boeing, of late, have struggled to keep up with its legacy in terms of being a strong player in the in aerospace technology and in models because of the crashes that it suffered, the Ethiopia Airlines, also the Lion Air crashes, huge tragedies. And then if we look at the behavior of Boeing behind those tragedies as well, it hasn't helped them in a marketing sense as well. So if we look at the finances behind them, we know that this has triggered a lot of reaction from the presidents or the leaders of these two regions. You've got President Trump saying he's going to slap tariffs on $75 billion worth of European goods, especially those coming from France. And that is because of his distaste towards how Europe, France have been supporting Airbus. So ultimately, in as much as these should be two independent businesses, they've got huge parents, the likes of the European Union and the United States, fighting in their corners.
Interesting. Now, how valuable are these tax breaks that Boeing stands to lose to the company?
Well, ultimately, they don't want to be in a position where they're losing money, especially because of obvious reasons with their models. As you said in your introduction, they were able to save around $100 million a year because of those tax breaks. So you can imagine that's a lot of money for a company. And if that means that, if them losing those tax breaks means that this obviously increases their costs, you can understand why they'd be fighting tooth and nail to keep the status quo. Yeah. It's all about trying to gauge whether or not these tax breaks are legal, or whether or not they give Boeing an unfair advantage nationally and internationally. So that's what you've got lawmakers in Washington debating over, because ultimately, in as much as you want to make sure an American company is supported by the American government, especially against the likes of a European rival, we have to make sure that we're operating in the basis of free and fair trade, and that's why the World Trade Organization has been involved. Of late, they have seemed to side with Boeing, and they have agreed that the tax breaks that they've been receiving have been legal of late. But again, with the twists and turns with this transatlantic trade war, it'll be interesting to see just how it continues to behave across the end of this year.
Okay, so not wanting to be sympathetic towards such a large global corporation. I do have to ask if you think Boeing can survive 2020, because as you've already mentioned, the Ethiopian Air flight, the Lion Air flight, both 737 MAX 8 Boeing planes. You've got the coronavirus, what it's doing to Cathay, what it's doing to Qantas, what it's doing to a number of airlines. And now you've got these tax breaks. You put this all together, and that makes for a really tough string of events for Boeing. So 2020 is looking like it could be a pretty bad year for them. I mean, how do you see it?
It started pretty badly for them. We know that at the end of 2019, Dennis Muilenburg was sacked as head of Boeing and replaced by David Calhoun, I believe his name is, at the beginning of this year. Right as he was about to take the helm, I do believe it was on the very same day that Iranian airline, that crash in Iran happened. We know that that's not a mechanical fault. That was actually an external interference. But it is a hallmark of the fact that Boeing, aside from this talk about tariffs, they have been struggling internally. It It just so happens that externally you've got the issues with coronavirus, and we know that it's inevitable that the impact of that virus will take its toll on companies, as we've been seeing with Qantas.
Right.
It is inevitable that it will also have a financial impact negatively with Boeing. But with the question, do we think that Boeing will be able to weather this storm? Absolutely, but that's just not all of their problems solved, because internally there's a huge issue with leadership and ethics. And if this tax break situation goes in their favor or against their favor, there's still a lot that needs to be addressed inside Boeing, and that's why I think that they'll be struggling to keep up with not just Airbus, but keeping up with its own legacy.
Right.
When you've got a company that has been able to dominate this space for a huge country like the United States, it's disheartening to see that within inside there is, I don't want to say corruption, but definitely mismanagement up until this point. So there's a lot that Boeing needs to address, and as we look ahead to the US elections, whether or not President Trump will secure a second term or if he'll be overthrown by a Democratic alternative, it'll be interesting to see just how they look at this Boeing relationship.
Okay, all right, real quick, we only got a few seconds. I've got these giant routes here.
Yes.
Top 10 airline routes by revenue.
Right.
Asian routes are up there, and they're pretty lucrative. Should Qantas have complied with the Australian government, knowing how much these Asian routes are valuable to them?
They didn't have any choice. I think in the light of social media justice, I think they knew better than to listen.
Yeah. Adefemi, thank you so much for joining us and giving your insights on the aviation industry and all the impacts that's going on with the coronavirus. Thank you so much.